Good evening. Welcome all. I'm Meena Upadhyay, Professor of Medical Genetics at Cardiff University. This seminar on COVID-19 has been organized by the Ethnic Minority Women in Welsh Healthcare, in short, EMWWH. The mission of this organization is to connect Black, Asian, and minority ethnic women in healthcare in Wales, and to create a supportive and empowering network that promotes equality and diversity. My co-chairs for this evening include Professor Sue Denman and Dr. Jeff Allen from Cardiff University. Sue is an emeritus professor at medical school. She's also a member of the EMWWH board. Her professional background is in public health and research and development policy. Jeff is a lecturer in Cardiff Medical School. Let me go over the housekeeping rules. This meeting will be in the format of a webinar. Only panel members will have audio-video access. All other attendees will be in listen-only mode. Use the question and answer box to post questions for each talk. The questions will be answered at the end of the last talk. And please note, we will be recording the talks this evening, and you will be able to access this from our website. And the address of our website is emwwh.org. EMWWH is organizing a series of lectures on the lived experience of healthcare workers dealing with COVID-19 patients. For the second seminar in the series, we have lined up excellent and renowned speakers who will be sharing their harrowing experience of working in critical care, medicine, and nephrology. I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker for this evening, Dr. Matt Morgan, an eminent consultant in intensive care medicine and head of critical care research and development. He's also a clinical editor of prestigious British Medical Journal. He has worked in some of the largest hospitals in the UK and Australia and won prizes for his research, including his PhD studies, which used artificial intelligence to solve complex medical problems. Dr. Morgan is renowned in his field, and recently he has been on the television on numerous occasions and has over 7,000 followers on Twitter. He has written a fantastic book entitled Critical Stories from the Front Line of Intensive Care Medicine. I recently obtained a copy of this amazing book from Amazon. It is filled with stories of survival, hope, and loss. And I have to admit, it is a must read. Now over to you, Matt. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and thank you all for joining us. I'm going to start with a diary entry. Tuesday, the 10th of March, 2020, 10:05 p.m. This morning, I packed my car with a sleeping bag, a roll mat, food, toothpaste, and clothes, because I'm not sure when I'm going to be coming home again. I switched off my normal Radio 4 and put on Mellow Magic. I'd also upset Alison, my wife, after sending her an email late last night entitled, "Things You Should Know in Case I Die." Along with passwords and the location of important documents, I'd written, "I've had a bloody wonderful life. I've travelled, I've partied, I've had 2 amazing children. I've spent time with friends, family, and done things I've never dreamed of. I love my job, although it can be dangerous sometimes and hard, often. Touching the lives of others is the best feeling in the world. The start of my standard 13-hour shift in the intensive care unit. The first challenge is where to go physically. For the last week, there have been huge changes in the localities of the beds in the ICU, with a special large ward area open for those suffering from COVID-19. We have one patient being treated in ICU at the minute. It feels like the calm before the storm. I go to check him and make sure that his ventilator is helping him the best it can. We're also checking that he's lying on his front, because prone ventilation has been shown to save lives. I get an email from a Canadian friend working in an intensive care unit in Canada. It shows me a photo of hand sanitizing gel that's been ripped off the wall in his hospital. This hasn't happened here yet, but who knows what the future holds. Today, my lunch, a cookie. It's hard coming home after a day treating the sickest of people, and I've been incredibly busy since the start of the COVID outbreak. My wife Alison has called me a body with a phone attached. I tried to do bath and bedtime for my girls, but my mind really is elsewhere. Tonight I'm going to sleep in the spare room because I've been surrounded by viruses all day. So I wanted to start this and to do this talk in a slightly different way. It's called a lived experience, and I want to show you that lived experience. And rather than a series of slides with words and pictures, I want to try to take you into the world of intensive care over the last 4 months. So I'm going to be reading some entries from a diary that I wrote at the time. And for those who have sharp eyes, you may spot this is a Harry Potter book. I grabbed it off the shelf one morning before going to work. I thought I might make some notes in it, because writing for me is a way of kind of understanding my thoughts, really. And that's where that started. I'm also going to be sharing some video footage, which I haven't shared very much before, from actually during the pandemic at the time, and I'll be sharing that here as well. Now, in many ways, a pandemic for somebody working in the intensive care unit brings us full circle. Mina very kindly mentioned my book, which is called Critical, and available from lots of independent bookshops as well as Amazon. And this book purposely starts in 1952 at the start of the intensive care unit. And intensive care started with a viral pandemic. It started in Copenhagen with a little girl called Vivi, who developed polio as part of the Copenhagen polio epidemic. And so it's strange now that that's come full circle and we are standing at the foot of yet another viral pandemic. And that first diary entry for me was really the start of it. We had had a big extraordinary meeting in Cardiff where we looked at terrifying projected figures. I put a car full of clothes in the back of my boot because we generally didn't know when this would start. We developed a checklist so that people could care for patients with COVID who may have never worked in the intensive care unit before. And that day, actually, after writing that, I thought about my own family. I thought about my parents, who are in the at-risk category. I thought about my brother-in-law, who's got severe chronic health conditions. And yet every time I looked at the news, all it really discussed was, don't worry, this virus will only be a problem for those who are frail, elderly, with underlying health conditions. And I thought, well, that's my family. And so that night I wrote a letter, actually, which was really to my parents, if anything else, outlining what intensive care can and can't do. That's called A Letter from ICU, which I'll post in the chat later. You can Google it. And it clearly struck a nerve because it was read about 250,000 times, and then on Channel 4 has been seen 3 million times. And I think it spoke to people's worries and tried to reassure them that intensive care is what it says. It's about care. It's not always about treatment, but it's always about caring no matter what. I had some lovely responses from that. I also had some pretty hard responses to read. People who were very upset that I brought up issues around end-of-life care, issues around what is and isn't the right thing to do. And some of those responses were pretty hard for me to read, actually. Quite personal, quite aggressive sometimes, but that's okay. It is a difficult subject to talk about, but talking about it in a controlled manner rather than at 3 in the morning on the intensive care unit when your family member is critically ill, that is the time to do it in a controlled manner, not at 3 in the morning. And then just a few days after that diary entry, that's when things started to get busy. And of course, no battle plan ever survives first contact with the enemy. And despite all the enhanced preparations we've done and simulation, that first patient that I looked after was in a busy A&E department where resus was full. There was another patient being cared for at the time, and all of that comes together. So I'm going to play you the first of 3 videos now, and this will try to immerse you into how it felt like at the time. Hopefully this will technically work. Just a few moments and this video will hopefully play for you.
Okay, so it's about 8 o'clock at night. I've just arrived at the car park in Cardiff to start my second night shift in a row. Last night was pretty busy with critically ill people with COVID and with not COVID. I'm not wearing any works clothes today, which feels a bit weird, so I'll be dressing into scrubs or a surgical outfit when I go in, so I don't have to take dirty clothes home with me. I've tried to listen to something different on the radio on the way, rather than the news or a podcast about medicine. I've put some easy listening acoustic music on the way, and I think that's been fairly good. Anyway, there's a long 13 hours ahead of us. There's not many cars in the car park, actually. It's Sunday night, and I will see you all in the morning.
Okay, we are moving on now. We are moving on a month later. It's now Friday, the 10th of April. People imagine that the toughest decisions we make at the coalface of medicine in the intensive care unit are often medical ones. What drugs should we use? What knobs should we turn on the ventilators? Yet the reality is rather dull. The toughest decisions that we often make, especially during the COVID-19 crisis, were much more mundane, yet much more important. These were decisions such as how can we accurately keep track of hundreds of new patients? How can we disseminate complex information to large teams of people that change recurrently every 12 hours? How can we talk on phones while masks cover our faces and no one remembers phone numbers? How can we quickly train hundreds of dental hygienists to care for critically ill patients? It's these decisions about communication, about logistics, about training, and about workforce that actually give us sleepless nights, not the medical ones. Medicine is what we do, it's what we know, we feel it, we live it, we feel at home with it. I'm happy surrounded by complex machines, monitoring waves, endless amounts of data about patients. That's where I feel comfortable and at home. But when we have to decide on which walkie-talkie to use to speak to an isolated nurse on the unit, that's when the real stress sets in. So while the government over the last week have focused on the procurement of goods, ventilators especially, what we really need to procure are better systems of thought. The best advice this week, actually, from a colleague, a trainee, was that no matter how busy you are over the next few weeks, make sure, as much as you're able to sit down, eat your lunch at a table, not in your lap, and with a knife and fork, like a human. None of this sandwich on the go nonsense. So that was when the real busy time started. And in Cardiff, where I work, we had up to 15 patients with severe COVID admitted into intensive care in a 24-hour period. And that's where all of these systems really came into place. But intensive care is no longer a place with walls up. And it was, by definition, the ultimate form of teamwork, in with the acute medical team, with specialties throughout the hospital who may not even work in medicine. And working as a team wasn't just important, it was unavoidably essential, and getting through that is the only way. We also had practical difficulties. The supply of oxygen to a hospital isn't only dependent on the actual amount in cylinders, it's dependent on the pipework in the hospital. So if we suddenly increase the amount of people by 200-300%, needing high amounts of oxygen, how do you cope with that? You can't simply replumb pipework in a matter of days or weeks. Measuring patients in intensive care is bizarrely one of the most impactful, important things you can do. By avoiding harm, we need to know patients' height so that we can work out how much breath to give them on a ventilator. How do you measure the height of 80 more people recurrently when the very tapes become contaminated? So that's the time where we picked up the phone, picked up the email, and asked IKEA for help. And next thing, we had 500 tapes made out of paper, which are disposable, from IKEA being donated. And really this time, it almost felt as if, coming back to the Harry Potter analogy of the diary, it felt like a sorting hat for life. People that you may have worked with for many, many years, who maybe you put into a certain box as a personality type, actually people's true selves, people's best selves often came out during these problems. Sometimes the people who you may have thought in the past were shy or not particularly motivated, next thing they are there, forefront, doing a leadership role, speaking up. It also brings out other characteristics in companies, and it's a sorting hat there as well. We had massive support in the hospital and the intensive care unit from amazing independent businesses, from Sub-Zero Ice Cream delivering 200 pots of ice cream on the hottest day in May, all the way through to Michelin star chefs like James Summerin delivering hot food every lunchtime, every evening without fail to staff. And it's those little things that really get you through. The other difficult thing to say, and it's sometimes hard for me to say this, because we've all seen the narratives on television about how tough things were. And of course, it absolutely was. It was really hard for families, for staff, for nursing staff wearing PPE for 12 hours a day, absolutely. In some ways, working as an intensive care consultant where your very life is solving problems, sometimes that you don't have any preparation for. There were politicians talking about ventilators and intensive care. We were having food delivered to the hospital. We were being recognised. Intensive care was no longer the wallpaper trying to save lives on the wall. And so in many ways, some people thrived in this environment. It was kind of what we were trained for in a strange way. There's a quote that says the two most important days in a person's life are the day they were born and the day they discover why. And for many people working in intensive care, this was the day they discovered why. They found purpose. And in some ways, it was enjoyable working at those crisis moments. The time where it's hard actually is now, when a lot of that energy, that excitement, that clapping, the food has stopped, the governments have stopped talking about intensive care, yet we are left with many of the logistic challenges. Plus, we are looking at a winter, which normally the summer is a downtime to recover for the impending winter. So actually now is often the tough times. One thing I'll always remember, however, is walking out of the intensive care unit, taking off the PPE, reaching to the right-hand side to have a drink of water, and there on the left-hand side would be a wall full of rainbows that were sent in from members of the public. And it was those little differences which make a big difference, actually. After you've dusted off your instincts, done the medicine, you see those to your left-hand side, and that makes a big difference. The other thing to say is I encouraged people during the pandemic to remember it's still okay to find joy in life. There was a feeling that it was quite a consumptive feeling that every moment of every day, every WhatsApp message, every email was all about COVID. But It was also my wife's 40th birthday. During that time, it was my daughter's birthday. The sun was shining, and it's okay. In fact, it's important to remember to find some joy. And I remembered that after a shift driving home, I thought I need to focus in terms of finding this joy because it's easy to lose. And in fact, on that way home, I called into an advert before lockdown and actually managed to buy myself a tiny little ukulele. And so my joy during those times, and those fallow times after night shifts, was pouring yourself into something small which can just switch that mind from one mode to another. Right, I'm going to share the second video with you all now.
Right, well, it's my first day in a pretty long run of shifts. I've only been in the hospital for about 2 hours in the COVID area, and I just wanted to show you what the personal protective equipment actually does to you. And this is just 2 hours in that area, yet alone what the nursing staff and cleaners and other parts of the hospital have to go through. But you can see it's really pretty sore at the sides, behind your ear, on your nose. I've even worn one of these protective parts actually, which can come off, but it's pretty uncomfortable. I'm looking at myself on this phone, I'm looking pretty tired, and it's just a couple of hours in. We'll see you later on.
Okay, so we're going to move on to our last diary entry now. Sunday, the 10th of May. COVID has brought new memories for us all to carry. In a decade's time, I'll remember not only knocking on the doors of patients and their families as I did researching for my book Critical, but also pressing the rubber keys on a phone pad. I chose intensive care as a medical specialty because I wanted to think as well as to act. I now realise that above all, what I really want to do is to communicate with patients, with families, and with colleagues. Communication is healthcare's most valuable and yet its most dangerous procedure. Verbal dexterity matters much more than manual. Yet COVID has stolen face-to-face communications with families when they need it the most. Instead, we now break bad news through the twisted cord of a telephone, where the power of silence can sometimes be mistaken for a hang-up. I know from personal experience that even the sound of your own ringtone on a television program can induce panic when you're hanging on for news about a loved one who is unwell. What if that's the hospital, you think? So now I try to start phone calls to families with, don't worry, this isn't a bad news phone call. But not this time. That would be a lie. It is bad news, the worst. I begin, I'm so sorry to do this over the phone. The call ends with quiet sobbing. We promise to hold the patient's hand, to play his favourite song, to tell them that their family loves them, because soon after they die. So to the nurses, the physiotherapists, the receptionists who file the death certificates, the cleaners who clean the empty beds, we all carry COVID, not in our skin, but in our hearts and in our heads. How does it feel to work in an intensive care unit during a deadly global viral pandemic? Unsurprisingly, the number of appropriate analogies is small. In the early days, back in March, it felt a bit like being a first-time parent, living in a one-bedroom flat when your baby comes a month early and that baby is unexpectedly one of triplets. You start parenthood feeling knackered after weeks of sleepless nights. Your good intentions to paint the nursery and have your bags packed ready have slipped by. You worry about your ability to care for more children than your hands can carry. You also worry about how you're going to get through it all unscathed. Even if you have enough cots and nappies, the physical infrastructure of your flat is not fit for purpose. Yet, you do get through it. Adrenaline, love, and hope are your fuel. The early days are hard, the later days even harder, but your children do survive. You change your flat to better care for them, you get systems in place, you find others you can rely on, you cry, but you also laugh out loud. Will you come through unscathed? No. But most of the scars are ones that will heal and remind you of what you've achieved. Life will never be the same again, some parts worse, some parts eventually better. But it's after the novel has settled down and people stop offering help, that's when the real tough times begin. And I think that's true, reading those words again now. As I said, those tough times were tough, but also energizing. And now is the harder time, actually, in many ways. I'm going to share one more video with you.
Day of two halves. Well, it's 13 hours after I last sat in this car and turned the engine off, and here we are again. It's pretty dark actually. In fact, I'm going to turn this light on so you can see a bit better. It's been a strange day today. It's been a day of two halves. In some ways, people are getting used to the rhyme and the reason of the day. They're getting faster with putting on the PPE. They're getting familiar with the way patients respond who are critically ill with this disease. So they've been all really good points. It's also been a tough day, and it's been a tough day because today is the first time where people have lost a colleague, somebody who we all know fairly well has died, someone who has worked in the hospital for a long time, and that's always going to set people back. It'll make us think about them and their family, and it also makes you realise that this is a disease which we're all vulnerable to, no matter if you work in the hospital, don't work in the hospital. And that makes you think, especially now as I drive home to see the family and my two girls. Anyway, I'm going to put some music on. I'm going to maybe even sing and get back home.
So by far, the toughest time through all this isn't the medicine, isn't the ventilators, isn't the equipment. Like everything, it's families, and it's loss, and it's when hope doesn't come through, and that's ever more true when it's colleagues and when it's people you know. But as I said, there have been positives. The word intensivist is now in the dictionary. That wasn't before COVID. We have made great strides with communication with other teams, with intensive care. The walls of intensive care are a lot thinner than they were before. And as my colleague told me early in the pandemic, quoting a Levelers song, there's never been a day that lasts forever. My hope, I guess, going forward and looking over the next year is, even though the hand clapping is finished, I hope that translates into a long, slow hand clap, not from the public, who have done an amazing job, but now from politicians. They need to turn that clapping noise into something solid, something with meaning and something that's lasting. I'm just going to finish with one final piece of text. The darkest times often come just before the dawn. Although for many, the crisis may be waning, for staff that have been there at the dark times, now is when they need the help. Please turn the hands that were used for clapping into hands held out to pull us back up onto our feet. It's fine to drop a ball while struggling through life, so long as that ball isn't made of glass. Nye Bevan said that the purpose of power is to give it away. And this crisis has been fought not only with nurses, cleaners, doctors, care workers, delivery drivers, but by people, by you all. Thank you. We also have the power to choose the future. We now seem in a hurry to return to normal, yet we should be in a hurry to remember which parts of normal are really worth keeping. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, for your emotive and very inspirational speech. And it clearly reflects your commitment to your work and your coping strategy. And I feel they're both commendable. I'm sure there'll be many questions. I can see in the Q&A box, there are many questions for you already. Please keep on posting the questions in the Q&A box. And the next speaker will be introduced by Professor Sue Denham. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Mina. It's my great pleasure to introduce our second distinguished speaker, Dr. Shetty. Dr. Shetty is a consultant physician at the University Hospital of Wales in Cardiff. He spent time in the USA gaining specialist knowledge in stroke medicine. He was instrumental in initiating and leading the developments in stroke services at the Cardiff and Vale University Health Board and across Wales through the Welsh Association of Stroke Physicians, which he actually initiated in 1998. Dr. Shetty has contributed to several key multi-centre trials. He was chairman of the Stroke Research Interest Group of Old People and Ageing Research Network, Wales, between 2007 and 2010. He was given the Life After Stroke National Award by the Stroke Association UK in 2016, and the inaugural Welsh Stroke Excellence National Award by the Welsh Association of Stroke Physicians in 2018. In 2007, he became the first ever non-European president of the Cardiff Medical Society in its 137-year history. A very distinguished career. Welcome, Dr. Shetty, and if I can hand over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sue. I'm trying to share the screen. Jeff, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, I'll see if I can check that. Oh,
you can see that now?
Yes, you should be able to see it now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mina. Thank you for asking me to give this talk. These are my acknowledgements. I've used a number of graphs from the publication Health Equity in England, the Marmot Report 10 years on, and I've also used some graphs from the New York Times, the Globe, and the Mail. I have no conflict of interest to declare, but I just would like to caution everyone listening to this talk that this talk is based on currently available evidence in the medical literature, which is based on case reports, retrospective analysis, and relatively small prospective studies. So it's more than likely that more definitive information will emerge in the next few months, and maybe some of the things that I've told you may not hold true in the coming months. So we'll have to use this information with caution. The only abbreviation I've used in this talk is BAME. I'm assuming there are maybe some overseas listeners who may not be aware of what that stands for. That stands for Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic Groups. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about three things essentially. What we know about COVID-19 from the information we have gathered so far. How does it affect the nervous system? How do we diagnose and manage the neurological problems associated with COVID-19? COVID-19 is a RNA virus. It's a very clever virus. It can even proofread its own copies to make sure that it is a true copy, so that there are no mutations which may result in its destruction by the host cell. It spreads by droplets and contact mainly. There's a lot of debate going on right now about it's spread by aerosol. Most people believe that the first two methods are most likely mode of spread because the R number, which is the number of people affected by a single affected person for COVID-19, is around probably 2 and 3, which makes it less likely to be spread by aerosol, because a classical example is measles, which is a aerosol spread virus whose R number is about 18. So, but it's a debatable area. There's a lot of debate still going on. It is possible that it's spread by aerosol. The difference between aerosol and droplet is in the size of the particles. Droplets are about 5 microliter in size. They are heavy. They only travel for about 6 meters and then fall down. Whereas aerosols will hang around the air for a longer time, and they have got a, therefore, greater potential for infecting people who are exposed to it. As I said, this virus is very highly evolved. It actually, once it enters the cell, it delays the immune system from sounding the alarm. Normally, when a virus enters the cell, the defense mechanisms are immediately activated, and the host cells secrete certain chemicals which will eventually produce the immune response that eventually results in death of the virus. But this virus disables that system. But when the immune reaction does happen, it goes into an overdrive, producing the so-called cytokine storm, which is very harmful for the host. But the other important feature of this virus is that people who are infected with it are completely asymptomatic in the first few days. And this is the reason why we are seeing what has happened in the last 6 months. You may not believe it. If you go to the WHO website, on the dashboard, you can see that figure. On the 17th of January this year, there were only 5 cases in the entire world outside China. And today, this morning, there were over 13 million cases, and with 573,752 deaths. So you can see how amazingly infectious this virus is. And the areas of particular worry are India, Brazil, and America, where the infection is soaring every day. The initial symptoms of somebody who's infected with COVID-19 are like a flu, ordinary flu. So people have cough, fever, shortness of breath, fatigue, and so on. Some people may also have diarrhea. This information was obtained in the early days of the pandemic in the UK, and at that time people are not asking about taste and smell disorders, which has now become recognized as an important early symptom of the disease. And just today, they have also recognized that a special type of rash may also be a manifestation of COVID-19. But this is what we dread about when people are infected with COVID-19. This is the pneumonia that kills people with severe infection with COVID-19. And this is what has resulted in the millions of deaths that have happened across the world. What we know so far is that older people are much more likely to be affected by this virus, particularly older males are more likely to be affected. As you can see, over 60 are the high-risk group. And the BAME group, that's Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups, are particularly likely to be affected by COVID-19. But the most important factor in predicting death is age. People who are over 60 years of age are particularly at risk for death, and those who are over 80 have a hazard ratio of 11. So they are, as you can see, with the increasing age, the hazard of death progressively increases. And once again, the BAME older people are more likely to die as well compared to the white population. But the most tragic thing that has happened in this pandemic is the death of older people who are in long-term facilities such as care homes. In Canada, as you can see, extraordinarily, 81% of all deaths happened in long-term facilities. And in Britain, it was 27%. As you may have read, in Italy, some of the care homes were completely cleared of their residents because they all died of this terrible virus. So that's about general information about the COVID-19 infections. So how does it affect the nervous system? Virus is most likely to gain entry into the nervous system through the nose, the nasal mucosa, which has got the olfactory nerve, and it enters the olfactory nerve, and it has been shown to enter through the nerve endings, either by endocytosis or exocytosis. Both things happen. It can be taken up by the nerve cells, or there are also viruses are extruded by the nerve cells as well, which are then taken by other nerve cells. And inside the brain, the angiotensin converting enzyme 2 receptors to which the COVID-19 binds. There are lots of these receptors across the brain. And so the virus attaches itself to the receptor and then it enters into the nerve cell itself. The brain is a little bit protected by what is called blood-brain barrier. So when any foreign organism enters the brain, it can't immediately get into the brain because there is a protective mechanism normally which prevents these extraneous organisms from entering into the brain tissue or the cells, nerve cells. But the coronavirus has been shown to attach itself to the endothelial cell and then go through the previous mechanism I've explained here, then enter into the nerve cell that way, or it might use a method called the Trojan horse method. So it might enter a neutrophil and then neutrophil will get across the blood-brain barrier. So that's how it is supposed to enter the nervous system. So there are 3 or 4 main mechanisms by which COVID-19 causes neuronal injury. The first one is by direct infection of the virus, which can cause damage to the. Second one is the cytotoxic storm, which is widely recognized now. And the third one, I think it's very important one, is what's called para and post-infectious inflammatory and immune-mediated disorders. I think this is going to be the biggest group of disorders we are likely to see with this virus. And then in people who are extremely unwell, who are in ITU for a long period of time, who have other major complications, they may have consequences of those severe illnesses, which may result in neurological damage. And there may be a combination of all the factors described above. So these are the main things that have been observed over the last 6 months. Olfactory and gustatory dysfunction, myalgia and rhabdomyolysis, encephalopathies, inflammatory syndromes, ischemic strokes, and peripheral neurological disorders. I'll go through each of them in a little bit more detail. So olfactory and gustatory dysfunction was systematically looked at by this study, which was conducted in Belgium, Italy, France, and Spain. And they selected 417 mild to moderately affected COVID-19 patients, and they found that nearly 86% of them had olfactory problems and 88% had gustatory problems. And they usually occur together, and females were more likely to be affected than males. And the interesting thing is, in the Chinese studies, only 4 to 5% of the people were found to have these problems. The other important thing that was observed was that olfactory dysfunction may actually occur before the onset of other symptoms with COVID-19. The olfactory dysfunction persisted after resolution of all the other symptoms in nearly 2/3 of the patients. But in majority of the people, olfactory dysfunction resolved after 2 weeks. The higher incidence in Europeans is believed to be due to diversity in angiotensin converting enzyme 2 receptor expression. So maybe the Europeans have more of these receptors, which may enable the COVID to infect them more aggressively, perhaps. But the important message from this study is that sudden onset of anosmia or ageusia should be recognized as an important symptom, early symptom of COVID-19 infection before other things start happening. Muscle pain was reported in nearly 35–50% of the people, and rhabdomyolysis may also occur as a late complication. It is difficult to say whether this is actually due to COVID-19 or it may just be a consequence of the severe illnesses that these patients, particularly severely ill patients, suffer. But nevertheless, careful monitoring of renal function and muscle enzyme is important in managing COVID-19 patients, particularly those with severe infections. The first study that reported neurological manifestations came from China. Mao et al. Published this paper, and they observed neurological abnormalities in 36% or nearly 37% of the patients. And most of the patients who were having neurological problems were older, had more severe disease, and had more underlying disorders, particularly hypertension. And they showed fewer typical symptoms such as fever and cough. The main things they observed were strokes, impaired level of consciousness, and skeletal muscle injury. They didn't really systematically look for neurological problems at that time. I think the emphasis was on managing respiratory complications. There was a scramble to find adequate number of ventilators and hospital beds and so on. So I don't think that was their priority at that time. But subsequently, the National Hospital in Queen Square, they analyzed 43 patients who had COVID-19. 29 of them were definite, 8 were probable, and 6 were possible who had neurological complications. And they were analyzed systematically. And they found encephalopathies in 10 patients, inflammatory neurological syndromes in 12, ischemic strokes in 8, and peripheral neurological disorders in 8, and brachial plexopathy in 1 patient. And 5 patients had miscellaneous central disorders which were not fitting into any of these categories. Overall, in the medical literature at present, there are 8 reports of encephalitis, and encephalitis has been reported with other coronaviruses as well in the past, with the MERS and the SARS virus, which have come previously. So it is not surprising to find encephalitis with COVID-19 as well. So the important thing is that most of these patients had very severe disease, and most of them are older, although there were some younger people as well. And they presented with irritability, confusion, reduced level of consciousness, and seizures. And they may have, some of them had neck stiffness and psychotic symptoms as well. The cerebrospinal examination, fluid examination, showed lymphocytosis in 5 of the 6 patients who had a lumbar puncture done, and the virus was detected in the CSF of 1 patient. 2 patients of the 5 who had EEG showed generalized slowing of the EEG, and 2 had focal abnormalities. There was 1 patient who presented with psychotic symptoms followed by a seizure and was found to have non-convulsive status epilepticus. And MRI in 2 of the 8 patients affected showed typical features, as you can see here. This is a typical appearance in somebody with encephalitis, viral encephalitis. 2 cases of probable autoimmune encephalitis have been reported as well. And one of them had typical opsoclonus myoclonus kind of presentation, where people have multidirectional rapid eye movements and quick involuntary muscular jerks. This is a syndrome that has been observed with other conditions as well. Another patient had what's called features of limbic encephalitis, where this is a kind of a patient where they become drowsy and forgetful, and they produce fairly typical MRI abnormalities. In other conditions that are associated with limbic encephalitis, we come across these unusual antibodies called EMWWAA antibodies, LGI1 antibodies. But with these patients with COVID-19, these antibodies were not detected. There was one case of necrotizing encephalopathy described in a 50-year-old woman who presented with fever, cough, and altered mental status. And the MRI showed characteristic abnormalities, and you can see the changes in MRI indicating hemorrhage and necrotic areas, which is typical in hemorrhagic encephalopathy. And this is believed to be a consequence of cytotoxic cytokine storm. Acute disseminated encephalomyelitis encephalitis and myelitis are very rare problems which you come across in everyday life. It's a acute disseminated encephalomyelitis. It's a disease mainly of children with a UK incidence of 0.23 per 100,000. And this was observed within a few weeks after the infection with COVID-19, and patients present with focal neurological symptoms, often with encephalopathy. Initially, 2 cases were reported in middle-aged women with classical features of MRI abnormalities and CSF abnormalities with normal CSF. And both these patients improved with intravenous immunoglobulins and steroids. In National Hospital in London, 9 further cases were found in a matter of 5 weeks. So they apparently normally find this many cases in 5 months, whereas in 5 weeks they found 9 cases, supporting the theory that this is probably related to COVID infection, because these patients were found to have COVID infection as well. So their clinical features fitted with ADEM, and COVID-19 was not detected in CSF, and the neuropathological sample obtained in one patient did not show the virus as well, so there was no evidence of direct infection, and the MRI features were consistent with the ADEM. So therefore, there's a very good supportive evidence to suggest that this is an inflammatory problem rather than a direct infective problem. There is only one case of myelitis reported from China, where a 66-year-old man in Wuhan presented with hyporeflexia and sensory loss up to the level of T10, who was treated with dexamethasone and intravenous immunoglobulin, and he did quite well and was discharged with minimal disabilities. Guillain-Barré syndrome has been very much in the news in the recent years because of the Zika virus epidemic, which was very clearly associated with Guillain-Barré syndrome. There have been reports of Guillain-Barré syndrome with SARS and MERS as well. And now we have about 19 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome associated with COVID-19. 2 of the patients had what's called the Miller-Fisher variant of Guillain-Barré syndrome with ophthalmoplegia and ataxia and areflexia. Median age was 63 years, and usually the symptoms started after 7 days of onset of the disease. And 2 patients developed febrile illness 7 days after the onset of Guillain-Barré. So Guillain-Barré occurred before the febrile illness. 3 patients had diarrhea before the onset of the neurological disease. And 16 of the 19 patients had COVID-19 detected on respiratory swab, and in 2, the sample source was not specified, and there was 1 patient who was also positive for rhinovirus. 1 patient was diagnosed with antibody test. 13 patients of the 16 had lumbar puncture, and 13 of them had 11 of them had albuminocytological dissociation, which is typical in Guillain-Barré syndrome. In none of these patients, COVID-19 was detected. Again, supporting the theory that it is an inflammatory problem rather than a direct infective problem. Amongst these people who presented with Guillain-Barré syndrome, testing for other pathogens commonly associated with Guillain-Barré syndrome was reported only in 4 patients. So we can't be 100% sure that this is due to COVID-19 alone. Most of the people who had Guillain-Barré syndrome had demyelinating kind of neuropathy, and 15 of the 16 were treated with immunoglobulins, and 8 of them required intensive care. Unfortunately, 2 of them died, 12 improved, and 5 were left with ongoing disabilities. So last of the neurological complications is ischemic stroke. So in this study in New York, they've discovered that compared with influenza, COVID-19 is much more likely to be followed by ischemic stroke. So in this study, the mean age of the stroke patient was 69 years, and 58% were men, and stroke was the main reason for admission in 26% of the patients. So they came with a stroke and was then found to have COVID-19, whereas in others, the mean duration from COVID-19 symptom to onset of the stroke was 16 days. So basically, there is some evidence to suggest that people who had COVID-19 infection are probably more likely to develop ischemic stroke. I think we have to take this with a little bit of skepticism, because most of these people are elderly, older people with conventional risk factors for stroke, and some of them even had atrial fibrillation. So how much of the problem was actually due to COVID infection is open to question. And the other thing is, most of these people were not only older, they had very severe COVID infection. So which means that they will have pathophysiological problems which would make them prone to have clot formation. And there was clear evidence of inflammation and prothrombotic tendency in almost all the papers that have been published with strokes in relation to COVID patients. But the striking thing in this observation is that the mortality was much higher amongst the patients who had stroke in relation to COVID-19, which may reflect the fact that they had severe COVID infection itself, which could have contributed to the mortality. Just to give you the perspective, in Cardiff, the acute stroke mortality is about 8%. So this is considerably higher. Most of the patients I've described in that previous study were older people. In this American study, they presented 5 cases of stroke in relatively young patients who had few risk factors, although they did have, some of them did have some risk factors, but some of them had no risk factors at all. But again, all these patients had coagulopathy and vascular endothelial, probably vascular endothelial dysfunction because of the inflammation, and because all of them had severe COVID-19 infection. So I think the jury's kind of, it's not conclusive by no means that COVID definitely causes ischemic stroke. In majority of the cases, the ischemic stroke may be a complication of the severe illness that is associated with COVID infection in people who have already got significant risk factors for stroke. In National Hospital in Queen Square, they found 8 patients with ischemic stroke. They're also mostly older people, and they also were found to have thrombus in large arteries, and there was a clinical context of hypercoagulability in many of the patients. So in this series, there is some suggestion that maybe the COVID-19 infection promotes thromboembolism and thereby may be contributing to ischemic strokes. And this is an example of an ischemic stroke here involving the left middle cerebral artery territory. But the other observation is that the investigations that we normally perform for acute ischemic stroke went down dramatically during the lockdown period. This is an American study. So if they were doing about 500 MRI scans for acute ischemic stroke, it went down to something like 100 or something like that. So it did have an impact on management of acute ischemic stroke patients, which is very important. That might have a big impact on the outcome for patients. And the other thing is we don't know what the consequence of the lockdown on the health of the general population, and we may yet see what has happened to the general health of the population. This is a report from in the Times recently, so we might yet see consequences of the immobility that we were forced in the recent months. So how do we investigate neurological complications? The main investigation is MRI, lumbar puncture, EEG, and nerve conduction studies if you're dealing with peripheral neurological problems. And people are looking for specific antibodies. We haven't got anything at the moment, but we might yet discover something which might tell us that the problem is probably due to COVID-19. At present, we don't have any specific antibodies. Most of the patients with COVID-19 related neurological problems have responded well to steroids or intravenous immunoglobulins, and thromboprophylaxis appears to be very important in these people because thrombogenic tendency seems to be an important pathogenetic factor in these patients. You have all probably heard about remdesivir, which has been shown to improve the median recovery time by about 4 days compared with placebo. But there's nothing else at present. Therefore, FDA immediately approved this drug for use in COVID-19 treatment. So people who require supplemental oxygen therapy can be given this drug for treatment of COVID-19. More importantly, dexamethasone, 6 milligram a day of dexamethasone reduced the mortality by about 1/3 in people receiving invasive mechanical ventilation, and by 1/5 in patients who require oxygen, but did not have an impact on mortality, who did not receive any respiratory support. So as you can see, invasive ventilation is the group which recovered quite well. So in summary, disorders of smell and taste are the most common symptoms associated with COVID-19, and they may predate other symptoms and may be an early manifestation before other manifestations of COVID-19. Serious neurological problems seem to be uncommon and often occur later in the course, and mostly in people with severe disease and older people. Thromboembolic phenomena and autoimmunity seems to be the most important mechanisms involved in neurological damage. And patients who are delirious, drowsy, and those with abnormal neurological signs warrant further investigations. But I'll end with one final slide, and I think this is a very important observation, that the health inequity and its impact on mortality, the more deprived the patients are, more likely they are likely to die. You can see this is the least deprived, most deprived. This is male and this is female. And I think people who have not read this report, I strongly recommend you to read this report. I think it has got some very important messages for people who are decision makers in the government. If anybody is listening from the Welsh government, I strongly recommend them to read this report, because I think it's got a very important message. This is data from America, and again, exactly the same message comes across. To the left of this curve is the bad outcomes. This is better outcomes this way, and these are the some comorbid conditions like chronic obstructive airways disease, diabetes, chronic renal disease, and so on. Every one of those comorbidities is higher in people who are deprived or poor. And this one indicates the percentage of Black people in the worse off population. Almost highest proportion of people who are worse off, who have all these comorbidities, are Black people, and highest concentration of Black people. So basically the message here is that these are in various cities in America. It is amazing how exactly similar the graphs are. So message is absolutely clear. Health equity is an important aim, that goal we should be aiming for if we are to avoid major disasters even in the future. Thank you.
So do you want, thank you very much, Dr. Shetty, for this brilliant presentation, and really extremely informative. And we'll take the questions at the end. So the next speaker is introduced by Jeff Allen. So.
Good evening. Last but not least, I'm delighted to welcome another talented speaker, Dr. Naushad Al-Jungli. Dr. Jungli is a practicing consultant in acute medicine and nephrology in Cardiff and Vale University Health Board. Excuse me. He has a physiology research background, having previously investigated the effects of strenuous physical activity upon kidney injury and function during his PhD studies in Edinburgh. He has been directly involved in assessing and managing COVID-19 patients since the pandemic began. The evidence for kidney involvement in COVID-19, both directly and indirectly, is growing, and the impact of this disease upon the provision of nephrology services within South Wales is truly felt. Dr. Jungli will be giving a short talk on the evolution of this evidence based on his own personal experiences and possible future directions. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for introducing me, Jeff. So I'm going to give a talk on COVID-19 in the kidneys. As mentioned, I work for Cardiff and Vale University Health Board. I'm mainly based at University Hospital Llandoch, but also share my duties with the University Hospital of Wales in Cardiff. So just to begin, I've got no conflict of interest in this talk, just to clear matters up from that perspective. The kidneys have had some publicity recently in relation to coronavirus. And this was recently shown in a video clip from the BBC News. And if you go on Google and type in BBC News COVID-19 in kidneys, this video clip will turn up. And this is a short video on the patient experience of one particular individual who ended up on intensive care and requiring dialysis, or a means to take over the function of kidneys because of COVID-19. And recent figures show that more than 2,000 patients who admitted to ITU suffered kidney failure that required renal replacement therapy or dialysis. So this, aside from other organs, the kidneys are definitely there as a bystander of COVID-19 injury. So the structure of my talk, I will talk about how COVID-19 affects the kidneys. I will then move on to talk about the impact of COVID-19 upon patients who already have kidney disease. I'll briefly cover the treatment considerations that need to be looked at in detail when looking at kidney disease and COVID. And then I'll finally focus on the future challenges that we have from a kidney perspective. So just a bit of background for those who are uninitiated. The kidneys are very intricate organs. They're located retroperitoneally, so sort of towards the back part of the abdomen. You usually have two of them, And they're very intricate structures. And just what I want to point to here is this ultrastructure called the nephron. And you've got 1 million of these in each kidney at birth, and over time, in the absence of disease, they just fall off with and drop off with aging. But the millions of these structures in both kidneys contribute to numerous important functions that the kidney carries out, including, which effectively could be termed in simple language as cleaning the blood, maintaining fluid balance within the body, and dealing with various minerals and ions. And also it contributes to maintaining an individual's blood count and preventing them from becoming anemic. So they're very, very important organs. And when things go wrong, when these boxes go wrong, then a lot else can happen, which can be devastating. The kidneys are really important in another aspect, and I hope this graphic illustrates that, in that the kidneys receive a significant amount of blood flow from the heart, so it contribute the heart of the cardiac output, 20% of the cardiac output, the blood pumped out from the heart, actually is received by the kidney, despite the kidneys only contributing to about 0.5% of the mass of the body. And what this graphic also illustrates is that the renal blood flow is maintained within various sort of strict blood pressure range. And ensuring that you've got good blood flow ensures that you produce good amount of urine as well, which is another very important part of kidney function. So how does COVID-19 affect the kidneys? Well, I think the initiator really, what I'm going to start with by saying is that the lung injury, the fact that COVID-19 really attacks the lungs first, is basically the initiator to why the kidneys then subsequently develop dysfunction. And the hypoxia that results from lung injury initiates this process. So this is me. This is during one of my COVID-19 ward rounds, dressed up in basic, almost full PPE equipment. My colleagues in ITU, such as Matt Morgan, they would wear even more equipment. But this is me in A&E. And this is one of the patients that I encountered. So for those who are not aware, this is a chest x-ray of an individual with severe COVID-19 pneumonia. And if you look in both lung fields, usually those lung fields in a healthy individual should be black. But in fact, here we see dense shadowing in both lung fields, which signifies severe pneumonia due to COVID-19. And you can see various leads being attached to the patient, which indicates that this individual is very sick. So this individual ends up on ITU. And if we now break his condition down to what's going on a molecular or pathophysiological level, if you focus on the boxes in red here in this schematic, the lung infection damages the lungs. You get alveolar capillary membrane injury, so the units that absorb the oxygen and allow gas exchange and the blood vessels that surround it become injured. You get inflammation, where you get a gathering of cells and other chemicals which result in this process. And the lungs become somewhat leaky, and this presents lots of problems in terms of breathing difficulties and the requirement for ventilation. One of the consequences of this is multi-organ dysfunction or multiple organ failure, and the kidneys represent one of the victims. And in fact, the hypoxia results in a condition known as AKI, acute kidney injury. So just to explain some terminology, acute kidney injury denotes a sudden deterioration in kidney function. The hypoxia, which results from lung injury, directly affects the kidney. So the ultrastructure of the kidney, the epithelial cells, the tubules, which form part of this nephron, which I described earlier, they get damaged. You get a massive inflammatory cells which crowd into the kidney and cause problems with function of the kidney. And you get activation of other cells within the kidney, which cause further inflammation and upset. And if you go down to the bottom of this schematic, the end result of this is fibrosis, or effectively scarring within the kidney. And this actually represents a complex interplay between the kidneys being injured, which results in the lungs being injured initially, which then results in the kidneys being injured. And it sets up this vicious circle. And this sort of example would indicate that there's crosstalk, or the organs talking to each other and affecting each other. And this can be expanded even further to include the nervous system, as my colleague Dr. Shetty has described in detail, and also the heart. So many, as soon as this insult is affected by one organ, the other organs kind of follow suit. And in this case, when the lungs are injured, the blood flow to the kidney is impaired and hypoxia affects the kidney. This in turn impairs kidney function, and the regulation of functions such as fluid balance is affected by the kidney, and the fluid accumulation within the body affects the lungs, and this goes round and round in circles. So hypoxia as an initial event in affecting the lungs can affect the kidneys too. The other thing that I alluded to just earlier was a cytokine storm, or an inflammatory process from lung injury. So one of these molecules, which is termed interleukin-6, or a cytokine, has been avidly researched in the past as an initiator of kidney injury. And coronavirus has been known to upregulate the production of interleukin-6. And interleukin-6, and this is pretty old, is well recognized as an initiator of acute kidney injury. And this is quite a complex schematic, but I want to focus on the box in red, which I've highlighted. And as I said, this is the schematic from a paper in 2010, well over a decade ago, and it well describes the combination of interleukin-6 and its receptor. When this tags onto a cell, this can activate a cascade of events which leads to cell death, apoptosis, and necrosis. And if this happens to multiple cells within the kidney, you end up with acute kidney injury. So interleukin-6, and I'm sure there are other interleukins that are involved, and they will be discovered in due course as we learn more about this illness, is, I would say, a key player in the development of acute kidney injury or acute kidney dysfunction in COVID-19. And you may have heard of the treatment tocilizumab, which is one of these magic bullets or monoclonal antibodies. And it's the data that's coming out in relation to the prevention of kidney injury in COVID-19 patients is very early stage, and we only have some observational data at the moment. But by using tocilizumab to block the function of interleukin-6 is postulated to stop this cytokine storm from occurring and subsequent kidney injury. And again, this is another complex slide, but I just want you to focus on the box in red. This has been looked at in a mouse model using tocilizumab and inducing kidney injury. And those individuals who were those mice who had sepsis without any treatment, they were found to have very profound changes compatible with acute tubular necrosis, or death within the kidney, death of cells within the kidney. But when you treated these patients with tocilizumab, they showed less damage from a histological perspective, and also from a molecular perspective. And also, this is a mouse model. It's a kind of proof in principle that tocilizumab could have good benefits. So it's been used in as a treatment arm in the recovery trial, which you may have heard in the media and in various medical journals. So, as I said, data for the use of this interleukin-6 inhibitor is at a very early stage, but looks promising. how else does COVID-19 affect the kidneys? Well, another postulated mechanism is known as renal microembolism. So effectively, the renal circulation is being clogged up by blood clots. And in fact, this was noted by colleagues in respiratory medicine and intensive care medicine who were finding that ventilating these patients was becoming increasingly difficult. And it was after imaging their lungs in more detail, in fact, they found that COVID-19 was also causing the development of pulmonary embolism. And in fact, we now have histological evidence from patients and autopsy that microembolism actually occurs in the renal circulation in COVID-19 patients. And just to orientate you, this is a light microscopy slide of the renal microstructure. The large area here represents one of the filters, the glomerulus, and here is one of the renal capillaries, and you can see it's filled in with a red material, and this represents thrombus. So renal microembolism is another reason for why we may develop kidney dysfunction following COVID-19. So this summarizes the sort of three mechanisms, key mechanisms, where the kidneys could develop an acute kidney injury due to cytokine storm, hypoxia due to the pneumonia, and hypercoagulability, which leads to thrombotic events. All those play an impact in the development of an acute dysfunction in kidneys, in the kidneys. But now we're seeing emerging evidence, and I must say this is coming from sort of observational data throughout the world, that the kidneys themselves may be directly affected by the virus. So what I've described above, the hypoxia, the cytokine storm, and renal microembolism, they are events that tend to occur downstream from the initiating events of COVID-19 affecting the kidneys, which is its primary target. But now there's evidence of direct cytotoxicity. And this is a slide which summarizes some histopathological analysis of 26 post-mortem patients who had COVID-19 in China. And through electron microscopy, which is detailed microscopic examination of the kidney, they found evidence of COVID-19, or SARS-CoV-2 virus within the microstructure of the kidneys, the tubules and podocytes. And they concluded that direct parenchymal or kidney tissue infection of tubular epithelial cells and podocytes with marked acute tubular injury occurs in patients with severe COVID-19 presentation. And in the States, they found COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2, was causing a type of kidney disease which we usually associated with HIV, patients with HIV, called collapsing glomerulopathy. And they examined 6 Black patients with COVID-19 acute kidney injury and proteinuria who underwent kidney biopsy and detailed RNA analysis. And these individuals had significant kidney dysfunction. And they found one of those 6 patients recovered, 2 of them died, and 4 required dialysis. And all individuals had this collapsing glomerulopathy picture, which we usually associate, as I say, with HIV infection. And this of significant note were in patients of African ancestry, which highlights this association and severe prognostic implications in the sort of BAME population. So I've covered how COVID-19 affects the kidneys, and that sort of includes individuals who do not have kidney disease. But I've seen in my practice patients with kidney disease who have been affected by COVID-19. And this includes a wide spectrum of patients who have got chronic kidney disease, so who've got pre-existing kidney scarring. And we classify chronic kidney disease in 5 stages. So stage 1 is a mild stage, And stage 5 chronic kidney disease are individuals who are on the verge of their kidneys completely failing. And not only those kidney patients I've seen COVID-19 affect, but also those on what I term renal replacement therapy. So those kidney patients who require therapies to take over the function of their kidney, such as dialysis and transplant. And what we've noted so far from the data that's emerged since the pandemic, that patients with chronic kidney disease or those who require dialysis or have a transplant, I will group all those individuals together for simplicity's sake as having all chronic kidney disease. They harbour other pathologies which confer an increased risk of hospitalisation and complication from COVID-19. So it's very common for individuals with chronic kidney disease to have diabetes, which is the leading cause of chronic kidney disease in the Western world, but also other pathologies such as hypertension and heart failure, which we know increase risk of hospitalisation and complication from this awful virus. Not only that, but these individuals, interestingly, who've got chronic kidney disease, they have higher baseline inflammatory states. Now, if we went back to the previous section, I talked about the development of inflammation and cytokine storm. So these individuals who've got chronic kidney disease, before they have COVID-19, they already run a higher than normal baseline of inflammation within their body. So you can imagine that if you add COVID-19 into the mix, this inflammation state is heightened potentially further, and they're more likely to end up developing a cytokine storm and resultant injury to their kidneys. And just to highlight this, the significance of other coexisting pathologies of chronic kidney disease with chronic kidney disease. This is some data from the renal registry, which collects data on a yearly basis on all patients who are on dialysis. And this table represents patients on dialysis in the UK. And I just want you to focus on the box in red again. And you can see that the percentage of patients with diabetes in all age groups is very high, and up to almost 40% in the 55 to 64 age group. So dialysis patients, as an example, they're at very high risk of complication from COVID-19. And I've seen that myself in my own experience with the dialysis unit I run independently in Cardiff. We've had several patients being admitted. Few, unfortunately, have died, but all those patients had diabetes as part of their coexisting pathologies, as well as requiring dialysis because of kidney failure. The outcomes of patients with end-stage kidney disease and COVID-19 is bad in general. This is some data from the Journal of the American Society of Nephrology, and from a particular paper, observational data looking just at 59 patients during the pandemic in the States, mean age of 63 years. Of those 59 patients, most of them were on HD hemodialysis. 56 were male, 75 of Hispanic and Latino ethnicity. So going back to deprivation, this is a population who are economically quite deprived. Of those patients that had typical symptoms on presentation of COVID-19 pneumonia, death in 31% of patients. That's huge. A third of patients died. 69% were discharged after 8 days, an average of 8 days. And just to highlight this point, of the patients who died, not only were they of older age, but had high admission white blood cell and CRP, which are markers of inflammation. And it says here in the conclusion, higher levels of inflammatory markers were associated with severe disease. So this just goes to highlight that this baseline inflammatory state, which is heightened in patients who have got kidney disease, must contribute to this poor prognosis we're seeing. Talking about the other type of renal replacement therapy are transplant patients. So these patients generally have normal kidney function in a manner of speaking. They have kidneys which do all the normal functions, but they're at risk of complication because they effectively are immunosuppressed due to the medications they take to prevent their kidneys from rejecting. This is some observational data, small number of patients, but this is from a London centre where they had 7 reports of COVID-19 in kidney transplant patients in London. And 4 of those patients needed ITU admission. So these patients are, these individuals who have kidney transplant and COVID-19, we're seeing some early evidence, although this is just some early observational data, that COVID-19 can cause severe illness requiring ITU admission with a high rate of acute kidney injury as well. And treatment of these patients is difficult because on one hand, they're immunosuppressed, which makes them more susceptible to infection and its complications. But on the other hand, you don't want to completely stop the immunosuppression, otherwise you run into trouble with acute rejection of their kidneys. So this is a very difficult area, and only with emerging data will we have a clearer picture of what to do in these individuals. So I'm moving on to my third section, treatment considerations in patients with kidney disease. So in my experience in treating patients with kidney disease who present in the front door, and I work as part of my duties in the acute assessment unit, so I've seen probably a dozen cases of individuals who've got kidney disease and COVID-19 pneumonia. The initial treatment of these hospitalised patients is no different to the standard, what I would term, non-comorbid patients. So the young, fit individual comes in requiring hospital admission with a COVID pneumonia. So what I mean about that initial treatment is controlled oxygen, broad spectrum antibiotics, intravenous fluids and antipyretics to prevent reduced fever. But the caveat here is that individuals with advanced kidney disease, the drug doses for specific drugs that and that includes those that may be used in COVID-19, need reduction and need consideration of reduction. And in fact, some may not be used at all. So I'll go through these medications in turn. So we know from the recent significant recovery trial that dexamethasone has shown great benefits in reducing the inflammatory impact of COVID-19 in individuals. In kidney patients, this requires no dose reduction. In fact, we use steroids often in patients with inflammatory conditions related to kidney dysfunction. So that's no surprise there. Low molecular weight heparin, so these are medications to reduce the thrombogenic tendency of COVID-19. These require dose reduction. So you can use them, but the dose needs to be reduced, and there is local guidance within all hospitals in the UK on how to prescribe this. Hydroxychloroquine, which was part of many trials in the UK, and from my perspective and many other people's perspective, I think has a very dubious benefit in COVID-19. There is no clear guidance, in fact, for the use of hydroxychloroquine in renal dysfunction, and the manufacturer simply advises caution, which is not very good guidance. Remdesivir, which has been shown to have benefit in reducing time of hospitalisation. There's a lack of data for individuals who have approximately 30% or less kidney function. And the current trials have excluded individuals with acute kidney injury and those on dialysis. So the use of remdesivir is a bit of a grey area at the moment. This magic bullet, tocilizumab, this interleukin-6 inhibitor, the manufacturer advises to monitor renal function closely in moderate to severe impairment. And there's no currently specific information available, but it's being used from my knowledge in individuals with kidney impairment. So to summarise, I mean, we've got these treatments which are great potential benefit. I think dexamethasone has shown some clear benefit, but and the use of low molecular weight heparin to reduce the risk of thromboembolism. But the other medications, I think, we need to I think we need to watch this space still, because we're not sure how they're going to be used for individuals with severe kidney impairment. So we need more trial data on these specific treatments. So I come to the final part of my talk, future considerations. And I'm talking about future considerations from a kidney perspective. You may have heard in the news recently, certainly from Sky News, that the longer term impact of COVID-19 is being felt. And there's been some report from Italy that now the aftermath of COVID-19 is being felt from a health perspective. Individuals are taking a long time to rehabilitate following their COVID-19 illness, particularly from ITU. There have been issues with memory problems, with getting back to normal physical functioning. And this includes organ dysfunction, specific organ dysfunction. And this is a slide that I use to illustrate that. And I use it in a lot of my talks in individuals who develop an acute kidney injury, such as that from COVID-19, so an acute disruption of kidney function from COVID-19. Let me orientate you to this. So if GFR represents your kidney function, so we start at 100%. So let's take the healthy individual who develops acute kidney injury due to COVID-19, and they are hospitalized and develop a severe kidney dysfunction. So their kidney function falls from 100%, if you track this red line, down to probably about 20%. They spend a period at ITU between 3 to 9 days, and then they recover, fortunately, and they make a full recovery. And this is great. The kidneys repair themselves, and they get back to their baseline kidney function. So they get back to 100% kidney function. They're fine, they make a good recovery. But what we may be seeing, certainly I would say almost definitely, is that we're seeing individuals as well who start at 100%. If you follow this black line, they go down this pattern, develop severe depressed kidney function, and they do recover, but then they don't recover 100%, say they're 50%. And these individuals, they may go on to develop progressive decline in kidney function over days, weeks, months, and years. And then we get the individuals who have already got chronic kidney disease. This is represented by the blue line here. So they take this journey, they go down, they end up in ITU, they spend a period on ITU dialysis. And these individuals, and this may include individuals from the black line too, they never recover. They end up on dialysis indefinitely. So this is worrying. So I think a lot has to be done if we're to lessen the renal impact of future waves of COVID-19, and a lot has to be done now. A lot has to be considered now. If we don't take action now, we could be landed with more cases of acute kidney injury. This has clear implications for my own colleagues in nephrology and intensive care on how we treat acute kidney injury. And these individuals might not recover and require dialysis. And dialysis is very expensive in the acute setting, in hospital, and in the chronic setting as well, in the long-term setting. It doesn't only require expensive machines, but it requires expensive expertise as well, and a lot of time and training. So if we don't look at this in detail and if we get subsequent waves which are very severe, this could be a real issue. We may not be looking at only needing more ventilators, but also more dialysis machines. As I mentioned, we could be seeing more patients with new chronic kidney disease and existing patients with worsening chronic kidney disease. How do we fit these patients in? How do we follow them up in the midst of a pandemic? This is a picture of an empty outpatient clinic, and this is how a lot of outpatient clinics are looking like at the moment, because we're trying to manage these patients remotely through video consultation. But imagine if we can't do this. Imagine if we have subsequent waves with increasing numbers of chronic kidney disease. How do we cope with this? So this needs to be thought about carefully. And will vaccines work? There's a lot to talk about vaccines, a lot of excitement, a lot of anticipation, but will they work in patients with chronic kidney disease? And I exemplify this through some research that's been done decades ago. Now, I just want you to focus on the box in red there. So In my practice, patients on dialysis, long-term dialysis, who require dialysis for the rest of their lives, we typically vaccinate these patients for blood-borne viruses, because in dialysis we take blood and pass it through machines over and over again over many days and months and years. And these individuals need to be protected from blood-borne viruses such as hepatitis. And these individuals here in group 1, from this piece of research that was done over a few decades ago, these are individuals with moderate degree of kidney dysfunction, okay? And we know individuals with moderate degree of kidney dysfunction or moderate chronic kidney disease, they've got a relative immunodeficiency. So when you give them a vaccine, they don't respond to it well. And you can see out of 15 individuals, only 9 responded after repeated vaccination. Group 2, these individuals, denoted by these numbers, have far severe degrees of kidney dysfunction. Some of these individuals must be on dialysis, looking at these numbers from my knowledge. And you can see that the seroconversion rate here and the sort of vaccine sort of stimulation rate here was even less, sort of less than 60%. And in my experience, this is borne out. So I have individuals who don't respond to repeated vaccinations and boosters for hepatitis, and we have to leave them without a vaccine, basically, to be unprotected. We don't have any current alternative. So aside from the worries of whether vaccination is going to be okay in the general normal population, we've got serious dilemmas and worries about how these individuals are going to, kidney patients are going to respond to vaccination. So that ends my talk, and I want to sort of end with this little slide, and it just puts things in perspective and where we are currently. And this is the flag of Paris, and it has some Latin here which says fluctuat nec mergitur. And I got this saying from one of my late colleagues, who's one of my mentors, and he sadly passed away some months ago. And he had this in his emails, and I was very curious to what it meant. And what it means is, she's rocks by the waves but doesn't sink. So I think this kind of summarises our current state of play with handling COVID-19. So we're still in the midst of a pandemic, I would say. You know, we'd like to think it's not there. The sun is shining out there and people are out trying to lead the normal lives. And we're trying to, but we're still being rocked, but we're not sinking. But I think if we don't take heed of what we've learnt now and we make preparations while numbers are low in terms of what we're seeing through the front door, I think through subsequent waves we could run into real problems, particularly for individuals with kidney disease. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naushad, for your outstanding presentation. And now I will invite Sue to initiate the questions.
Yeah, we've had lots of interesting questions, and I think I'll put the first two to Dr. Morgan. Question from Diana, who used to be who was a critical care nurse, is now a nurse educator. She enjoyed your talk very much, found it very emotive. And the question is there any aftercare provision for staff in secondary trauma? And could clinical psychologists be involved at all, in your opinion?
Yes, so thanks for that. And thank you for using the word staff, because although I've spoken from my perspective and spoke about nursing staff, actually, you know, it's cleaners, it's porters, it's administrators, it's everybody involved, and not just ICU at all. You know, in medicine, in ED, in lots of areas of the hospital where this is important. We are lucky in Cardiff, we have a full-time clinical psychologist involved in intensive care. And although she started initially for patients, actually she spends half of her time with staff issues anyway. Many organisations throughout Wales recognise that they need to support staff and so have programmes in place. There is one locally in Cardiff. And also the Intensive Care Society actually is running a big campaign for support to provide this to members of intensive care specifically, which people can donate to if they want to. There's lots of information on their website. So thank you for that question. Yeah, really important.
Thank you. Another question, this one is from Chantal Patel. She says that you talked of better system of thought during your presentation, and she asks, what exactly would you like to have seen done differently?
I've written before that one thing that used to frustrate me in hospitals is when we get systems from business or commercial sectors imposed upon healthcare. For example, there's an agile system in industry which allows components to be built very quickly on a production line, and various people have tried to impose agile management on the healthcare system, and often that doesn't work for various reasons. I think in the pandemic, we could have perhaps reached out to other sectors and other industries, and in this case, it may have been helpful. So I'll give you two examples. When we have those days where there's 15 patients being admitted, there's hundreds in the hospital, we need to keep track of those patients. And when administrators are not able to work because of they're working from home, and when things change so quickly, it's really difficult. Heathrow was completely closed during COVID, so there were probably tens, 50, hundreds of air traffic controllers not able to work. We probably could have really done with their skills of tracking, tracing, techniques of keeping hold of those records. I mentioned dental hygienists in my talk, and we did train, I think it was 100 dental hygienists to look after critically ill patients in case that was needed. They were very helpful, but they were needed to do many of those tasks in the end, thankfully. But McDonald's was closed through the whole pandemic. McDonald's, as funny as it sounds, has an amazing system of training where they take people who've never worked in a restaurant. They have a really structured training program, and 2 weeks later, sometimes 2 days later, they are fully qualified to work. So actually, we could have maybe learned from some of these big scale systems of thought, and those are two particular examples.
Thank you very much indeed, Matt. There have been quite a few questions, and unfortunately we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to stop there, but we look forward to reading your book, those of us who haven't read it yet. Thank you very much. I'd like to move on to Dr. Shetty with some questions. I know that you've indicated one of the questions which you'd like put to you, so I'll start with that one. Why is there such an interest about whether COVID-19 is airborne or not?
I think the debate started because some scientists openly, they signed, I think 100 scientists signed a declaration saying that, yes, it probably does spread with aerosol. But I mean, it's debatable because the evidence is not, I would say it's not entirely supportive of their theory. It's only a theory because in reality, the way the virus is spreading, it doesn't support aerosol spread because, the R numbers are more in keeping with droplet spread rather than aerosol spread. If it is aerosol spread, I know things have really rapidly worsened from 5 cases to so many millions of cases, but things would have been much worse if it was spreading by aerosol. So that is one of the reasons why there's a lot of controversy. Not everybody agrees with that theory. So the theory came into limelight because some scientists publicized their views openly.
Right, thank you for that. A second question to you is quite long. Regarding patients who have suffered with COVID-19 but did not experience olfactory or gustatory dysfunction or neurological symptoms, is it reasonable to believe that they would also not have experienced para or post-inflammatory symptoms?
Yes, I think that's a good question. The important thing to recognize is that you see almost all these people who had serious neurological complications had very severe disease. So it is a complication of very severe COVID infection. So I think it's a consequence of the cytokine storm, the hyperinflammatory changes that happen with severe infection, that triggers these immunological manifestations probably. So therefore, people who have had mild disease, who have recovered, they have got no danger of developing it. And even in seriously ill people, the occurrence of these complications is relatively, the number of reported cases are relatively small. I mean, it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, but in the medical literature, there are very limited number of cases actually reported, even in people where in studies where they've prospectively looked at neurological complications. So just to summarize, it is probably safe to assume that if somebody had a mild disease and recovered, they're unlikely to have neurological complications. And if somebody is going to develop the problem, they probably will have had serious infection, and they are probably in the older age group.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shetty. I'd like to move on to asking Dr. Jung Lee a few questions. We've had comments as for all speakers how much they enjoyed your presentation, so thank you for that. My first question is, which factors influence the likelihood of fully recovering from COVID-19 without persistent symptoms, as opposed to having AKI or needing dialysis?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
So which factors influence the likelihood of fully recovering from COVID-19 without persistent symptoms, as opposed to needing dialysis? I took this question directly off the question and answer session.
If I understand this rightly,
Yeah.
it's which individuals are more likely to make a full recovery.
That's right. Yes.
From COVID-19. So I think with regards to the outcomes from the kidney perspective, I think if individuals don't have any pre-existing kidney impairment, and what I mean to say by this, they don't have evidence of kidney dysfunction as measured by an impairment through their blood tests, or the impairment in their urine, for instance, they've got protein in the urine, or excess blood or excess protein in the urine. Those individuals with without pre-existing kidney disease, if they subsequently develop a kidney injury that require dialysis, they're more likely to make a full recovery. So they don't have any background scarring or any background predisposition to kidney disease there. However, they may have other comorbidities which are indirectly involved with the kidney, such as heart problems or high blood pressure. And those conditions, in the absence of kidney disease, can make it less likely for those individuals to recover following a period of dialysis or kidney injury, or at the very least be left with scarring. So the take-home message, I think, if you've got fresh kidneys, there's a good chance that if you need dialysis, you'll come out with, 100% kidney function or thereabouts.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in fact, you've answered another question that on the subject, so we've killed two birds with one stone there. Ranjit asked, how do you protect yourself while inside the ITU?
Is that question, sorry, directed at me?
Yes, as I said.
Well, I must say I haven't. From a clinician perspective, protecting yourself in an ITU is probably matters more better place to answer that specifically. But from my perspective, when I go in and see patients with COVID-19, I do have to carry with myself a level of protection, which includes a surgical mask, a plastic apron, and I tend to double glove myself and also put a visor on. in areas where there's where there's aerosolization and there's suspected COVID circulating, maybe as an aerosol, then that protection goes up a level, and that was illustrated in one of the pictures of myself.
That's right. Yeah.
On the equipment I was wearing.
Yeah. Matt, would you like to comment at all on that?
So at the peak of the pandemic, we had nearly around 50 patients in critical care with COVID-19, and normally we've got a 35-bedded unit, so it was super busy, and everybody there pretty much had COVID. It was surprising that many other disease entities weren't there, and at those times it was very simple. Every area of ICU, you needed to wear full PPE. So there's a particular don-in station where you don all the gear. There's a particular doff-in station where you take it off. Now, and one reason I said it's a bit trickier now than before is because we're dealing with risk. Whilst before everybody had COVID, now we're dealing with uncertainty. So we've got 4 areas of ICU, 3 of which are designated as amber or red zones where you need to wear full PPE. So even though we currently only have a few COVID patients in intensive care, less than 5, we still need to wear PPE pretty much in all of the unit because of various reasons and cross-contamination and other stuff. There's a small area where you only need to wear a surgical mask. So it's still hard work for the staff, and patient visiting is still severely restricted, which is a big problem. I was working nights last night, and we do allow visiting for end-of-life care and other issues, but that's about it at the minute.
Thank you very much. And I think we've run out of time. It's 8:30. I'd like to thank you all for your comprehensive answers to the questions, and for the many attendees who've put forward such interesting questions. I'll hand over to Mina now.
Okay, so right, it's my pleasure to thank everybody. Particularly, we are very privileged to have such distinguished speakers for this seminar. I'm truly grateful to all the speakers for sharing their experiences with us despite their very busy schedule. I thank the lively audience and for their fascinating questions. My thanks to Professor Denman and Dr. Allen for co-chairing this meeting. And I also extend my gratitude to Divya, Ishrat, Aisha, Doctors Academy, and the Learned Society of Wales for their support. Finally, our thanks to many frontline heroes, in particular the healthcare and social workers who have put their lives on the line to save others. Our tributes also extend to all the families who have lost their loved ones. Look out for our 3rd lecture in this series in autumn. And thank you very much to everybody for joining us, and stay safe. And I hope you enjoyed this seminar. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.